Welcome back to another session. I hope you are well. In the session I covered previously, I made reference to the fact that I would provide, rather than a prescription, I would provide a description with regards to what I do with regards to health, well being, and more importantly, avoiding anxiety, depression by focusing on what you eat, diet. And so in this session, which will be a rather short one, because there isn't that much to say about what I eat, and I think it's not really that interesting anyway. Diet, nutrients, supplements is important. I have been humbled by how much I have learned, but also by virtue of how many people have been willing to help and guide me in this journey of understanding how the body functions. When it comes to depression, anxiety, and any form of disease we might have, the process of healing, well, let's start with preventing, healing, and full restoration and recovery begins with what you eat. Diet is the most important thing to focus on. Why? Because it's the most simple thing. Anybody can actually look at what they eat and choose. Most people can be selective about what they eat. The diet I'm referring to in this particular instance is what I call the paleo-ketogenic diet. Now, we've heard of this diet and it's been given different names and it stirs up so much emotions. And I've made a mistake, which I generally caution my loved ones not to make, which is when we have people around and when we entertain people and when we dine and wine people, I often say to my loved one and my beloved and the rest of the family that the label becomes the message. When you say diet, people think about the first three words of that word, D-I-E, which is die. There's a sense that the word diet means you're losing, you're giving up something. It's not just the sacrifice of something of a lower nature for something of a higher nature, but there's a sense of loss. And most people do not like the word diet. But also, even more importantly, we are very tribal. So once you say PK diet, the paleo-ketogenic diet, people think, oh, there they go again. I hope I do not alienate you and you do not run away by virtue of what I say to you. I'd like to share with you a consolidation of what I have shared over the past 30 sessions, which is how I eat and what I eat. The most difficult thing I found in my case was to change what I ate. I've been an athlete for most of my life. I'm someone who worked very long hours in the city. And I lived on sugars and carbohydrates. I mean, absolutely love sugars and carbohydrates. I would eat 6 times every day. There were times when and this is no joke, I would have a banana and an apple by my bedside table as I went to bed, because you could set the clock on the fact that between 2 and 3 in the morning, I would wake up very hungry, have the banana, and then have the apple, and back to sleep, to wake up at 5:30, sometimes 5 in the morning, to get ready for work. I lived on sugars. The transition, therefore, from a glucose-fueled lifestyle to a ketogenic fueled lifestyle was difficult, as with most things. I have looked back and said to myself that I wished someone had told me before about a different world, a different way of living, and a different way of lifestyle that did not limit my abilities. For someone who was very competitive with regards to sports, and still is, I have lost nothing. I've actually gained. So the most difficult task was actually changing what I ate. I'll break it down into 2 parts. There are 2 ways of fueling the body. You can fuel the body with glucose, or you can fuel the body with fat and fiber. With regards to what I eat, the fats fall into 2 categories. Well, let's start with the fats, saturated fats. And this would include things like lard and butter and ghee. Now, ghee, be careful if you have any dairy allergies, then avoid ghee. But if you don't, you can include those. Coconut oil and palm oil. In other words, any fats that is solid at room temperature is good fat. Now, in nature, we know that there isn't good or bad fats. This just brings me down to the whole concept of oils. The issue with what we consider good and bad fats is because we either heat them or we hydrogenate them to make margarines. Oils have to be consumed as an unsaturated, in its unsaturated form. And for this, My standard is omega-3 or omega-6 oils, and I tend to use hemp oil. It contains omega-6 and omega-3 in the right proportion, the ratio being 4:1. Perfect. We should consume oils cold pressed. We shouldn't use it for cooking. Before I came upon this knowledge, I used to cook with vegetable oil, sunflower oil, olive oils, and I would fry things with all of those oils. We should not. We should have olive oils cold, and we should have our omega-3, 6 oils cold pressed. So that's fats. The second fuel is therefore fiber. There are certain foods that contain good fiber, but there are certain foods that contain good fiber with carbohydrates, and therefore what you should focus on is to ensure you have food that do not contain an excess of carbohydrate, preferably 5% or less. What I tend to eat is linseed, which is something we use to make bread. You can make linseed bread. It only contains 2% carbohydrate, so you get some of your fiber from that and your fiber from your vegetables, etc. In addition to this, food that contains less than 5% carbohydrates, coconut cream, you have Brazil nuts, you have pelican nuts, you have salads, you have your green vegetables, mushrooms, your fungi, fermented food, sauerkraut, and more. The care aspect of what I've shared so far is you have to be careful about meat and fish. Now recognize that PK diet simply means paleo-ketogenic. You avoid all dairy, all gluten, and you reduce the amount of carbohydrates you take. You focus more on having good fat and high fiber. There will be some protein in that process, and there'll obviously be some carbohydrate in small proportion. But you want to pay attention to meat and fish and eggs, because a lot of the meat and fish and eggs sometimes we have, particularly the fish, have heavy metals. The meats sometimes are not raised in the right way. They're not organic meat and they're not from the right farming processes, and so be careful about meat. A PK diet doesn't mean you avoid, you eat too much meat. It means you eat meat or protein in proportion, in no proportions. But you want to minimize food with about 5 to 10% carbohydrates. You want to avoid foods that contain 10% or more carbohydrates. You want to avoid grains, which is what I do. Pulses, fruits. For someone who used to love fruits, I haven't had fruits for some years now, other than you might say berries and rhubarb. You want to avoid most nuts that are very high in carbohydrates, most seeds, and certainly you want to avoid junk food. You want to avoid, as a must, if you can, dairy products. You want to avoid gluten in your meals and in your food if you can. You want to avoid sweeteners. And here's the key thing. I've still talked about what you should avoid, but I started with what you should have, and I'll bring you back to what you should have, which is you want to be taking supplements, nutritional supplements, multivitamins. Very important, because the farming methods we have these days in the West are not sufficient to give us the nutrients because of how regularly the soil is harvested and looked after. So we're not getting all the nutrients we used to get from the soil, and therefore we have to supplement. Now, I'll end with the following, which is timing. Timing is very important. It's one thing to eat, and it's another thing to eat at the right time. So far in the past few years, I've been eating within what people call a 10-hour window. I started with 10 hours, and now I have reduced it down to 6 hours. My first meal is at 12:30, between 12 and 12:30 p.m. every day, and my tea, my dinner, is 6:30. So I eat within a 6-hour window, which means 16 hours autophagy, fasting. Fasting is key. Try it. I hope today's session has been useful.